This is a how-to-argue workshop that will explain, common pitfalls of arguing. Communication is hard, misunderstandings happen frequently. Arguing is even harder because it requires focused communication and thinking about complicated ideas simultaneously. So it's no wonder that we often have trouble and we fail to persuade people. So this workshop is designed for two situations. One, avoiding some of the common mistakes that cause us to be unpersuasive. And two, having fruitful conversations with others that make these mistakes. It's tempting to think of people as irrational or stupid in arguments when it's not going so well, and then not take them seriously or give up on the conversation entirely. But often, they're just making some specific mistakes that aren't fundamental but are avoidable, but they are disruptive to fruitful conversation. And these are mistakes that we can work around. So this workshop is about these mistakes and how to avoid them. So one of the main mistakes, this is a kind of a more fundamental mistake, is that people don't take it into account that arguments are all about knowledge. Whenever there is a disagreement, it means that someone is lacking the requisite knowledge. Like someone is making a mistake, or one side doesn't understand the other, or the other doesn't understand, whatever. These mistakes lead to many of the popular fallacies like ad hominem, argument from authority, and so on. All arguments are about knowledge. Some people go as far to say that certain habits in arguing can't be helped. Not knowing that all disagreements boil down to a lack of knowledge also makes it hard to take positive interpretations seriously. If the person that you're arguing isn't getting it, that must be because he's irrational or somehow is intentionally resisting your arguments. But in fact, that isn't the case. It's just that they don't know, they don't understand something. It's down to a lack of knowledge. And if you convey the knowledge well enough, then he will agree. You just have to find out how. Another mistake is repeating yourself. This is fairly common when people think that the other person hasn't got it, and so they think that they have to say it again. There are lots of reasons that people repeat themselves, but usually this is hardly ever necessary. If the person forgot what you were saying, then you just have to remind them. You don't have to say exactly the same thing. Only a few words will do, just to remind them. And if they didn't get it, then you should say something new, because they didn't get it for a reason. So if you're repeating yourself, think whether you yourself understand what the other person is saying. If you yourself don't understand it, that's a situation where you're tempted to repeat your criticism, because you figure that if they had been listening, they wouldn't be saying what they're saying. But in fact you don't understand, or something they don't understand, in which case you still don't repeat yourself. Why do you want to repeat yourself? They might be making a distinction where you thought that they were saying the same thing, but actually they're trying to say something different. In that case, then listen more, I guess. You should only repeat yourself if and only if repeating yourself answers a new point or is tantamount to making a new point. Otherwise, you should just avoid repeating yourself. If they didn't agree or understand the first time, it's unlikely that you'll get a different outcome just by saying the same thing again. Straight repetition only achieves something if they actually didn't hear you. All of this boils down to my first bullet point, which was the thing about knowledge. If they didn't reply for a reason. What are they missing? By the way, I don't know how much any of you make each individual of these mistakes. I don't know how much you do the repeating thing, but this is, if you do the repeating thing, here's some ways around it. If they're the ones who are repeating, then you should just say something new, maybe make some references to the previous way. So, for example, if you previously replied to the point by saying, yes, but dogs have 4 legs, then this time say, well, the 4-leggedness of dogs is one counter-argument to that theory. So if they don't have flippers, and therefore would be unlikely to be named Flipper, as dolphins might be. Hence, I think the dog probably wasn't called that. Anyway, this is getting a bit too complicated. But my basic point is, If someone is repeating, then don't just repeat what you are saying back to them, because then that kind of ends up with yes it is, no it isn't, yes it is kind of thing. What you should do is say something new. You can make a reference to the previous thing, but try and at least say it in a different way, if not say something entirely new. Another thing that people do is interrupting and stopping the other person from explaining something. So you're in the middle of explaining something and you haven't got to the point yet when you're interrupted. Or the person you're talking to is explaining something, but you've already got it, so you interrupt them. The ways of avoiding this, well, basically, shorter is better. So if you want to interrupt them, then if you do it in a shorter way, then that's generally better, because you can just say, oh, what about this? And then they can continue explaining, and then it isn't too bad. Likewise, if you keep getting interrupted, then maybe that's because you're taking too long to explain something, and so you should probably try to shorten what you're saying in more easy-to-digest chunks. If you find yourself replying with more points than the person made to you, then you're doing something which, if both sides would do, would lead to an exponential growth in points. If you say a lot of points, one after the other, and then they reply to those points and then make more points, and then you do that, then it'll have like loads of points. This will be more elaborated. But if you say stuff briefly, then they won't have time to interrupt. Make your one argument and then stop. Interruptions with a short point will be less disruptive than long interruptions. So basically, make your one argument and then stop, and that should get around this interrupting thing, regardless of whether you're doing the interrupting or the other person is. Were you about to say something?
No, I'm still caught up on, like, it's like an exponential increase by a factor of quite a lot.
Yeah, Russell had a quote that went something like, if God existed, you'd think there'd be one argument that proved his existed, not 100. So this goes to show that if you have a good reason for believing something, you don't need to give a list of all of the reasons it's true. You can just have one persuasive reason. So that's why having short things is better. So what if someone stops you halfway through what you're saying and goes on about a different point? The basic answer is that you should politely continue saying what you're saying. You can say so-and-so is a separate issue, but in regards to the original issue, the answer is so-and-so. Another mistake people make is assuming that they know what the other person's argument is. Doing this often results in you think you know what the person's argument is, but you actually have a misunderstanding. In arguments, there's always a misunderstanding or misconception somewhere, whether it's with you or the interlocutor or both. That's why there is a disagreement. If the content mistake is with the other person, but they're still not persuaded yet, then there's a reasonable chance that there is a mistake that you're making with regards to how to explain it to them. This is, again, what this workshop is about. It's about explaining things in such a way that they understand and doesn't lead you down a blind alley. So, if the person you're arguing with makes this assumption about what you think, then just contradict the assumption that they think you're making. So, for instance, if you think that they are assuming that you are against welfare because you think the poor deserve to suffer, then you could say, do the poor deserve to suffer? Not necessarily. Are they entitled to force others to suffer? No. And are they helped by welfare? Rarely. And so on. You contradict them, but in a non-meta way. Basically, you explain your ideas, and hopefully that will resolve their misunderstanding about what your argument is.
You're saying that rather than saying, no, I don't.
Yes. And this leads on to meta, which is one of the main things that damages arguing.